2 days earlier, at the airport, Miles sat by the boarding gate where he waited for his flight. He looked down at his phone. A picture of his cat was saved as the display's background image. He checked for missed calls, but there weren't any. Then he put his phone face down and held it against his leg. He knew Jessica wouldn't have swung by his house yet, but he paid special attention to his phone anyway, just in case. Waiting, Miles looked around, watching all of the people and all of the commotion. Some walking, some gliding, some riding, some sitting, and some lying down, delayed. Then it occurred to Miles that although all of those people were together in one spot, they were all also in various states of arrival and or departure. And then there were those with the desire to leave but lacked the ability. And so Miles promised himself, should he ever find himself hopelessly stuck, he would not lay down. He would stand up as long as he could. Being stuck, after all, does not always mean trapped. Then Miles looked around to his right and noticed an old woman seated 2 empty seats away. She stared at him. Beside her sat a man, half asleep in his chair. Miles could tell they were together because they wore matching black nylon jackets with patches on the sleeves and shoulders. Miles focused his attention on the old woman again and saw she was still staring at him, except now she was smiling kindly too. Miles, feeling a little awkward, broke the silence and said, "Hello." The old woman held up her hand and offered a still wave and said, "Are you going to New York? We're going to New York." She hooked a thumb over her shoulder, gave a quick glance at her husband, and said, "That's my husband. He's all but asleep." Then she gave a short laugh. Miles smiled and said, "Yes, I am going to New York on business." "Oh," said the woman. Then, in a more serious tone, she said, "I miss my cat already." Miles sat up. The old woman went on and said, "I want to see my granddaughter, my Mindy, and I want to see my daughter, her mama, but I miss my cat." Miles leaned over and pointed at his chest and said, "Me too." He whispered, "I miss my fuzzy little guy so much." Miles and the woman laughed together. Then she said, "I know, I hate leaving my kitty at all." "My name's Miles," he said. "Mine's Rachel." "Huh, that's my mother's name," said Miles. "My husband is Roy, but he's just about asleep." Then Rachel reached around and hit her husband in the arm. "Gonna board soon, Roy." Roy was motionless, but Rachel turned back to face Miles, who was sitting upright in his chair. He looked down at her jacket and admired the patches, which were shaped like different U.S. states. "I like your jackets," said Miles. "Thank you. I picked them out and I sewed the patches on," explained Rachel. "After Roy retired, we started driving a truck. So we go places, different states and cities. These jackets are like our uniforms. I'm the navigator and he's the pilot." "Oh, I see," said Miles. "Wow, the open road, huh?" "Oh, yes, it's wonderful. We really enjoy driving cross country. It's my preferred method of travel," Miles said proudly. "Yes," Rachel said, "and sometimes, like when they paint new lines on the road, but you're way out in the middle of nowhere, say somewhere in the middle of nowhere, Utah, and you think to yourself, oh boy, now who came all the way out here and painted those pretty new lines?" Miles and Rachel laughed together as Miles said, "You know, I've actually had that exact same thought." "It's true, but I'm sure grateful they did paint those lines for us folks who are out driving any old place, because I do not want to get lost out there," said Rachel as she turned to see her husband stir in his seat. Then a speaker overhead someplace crackled and a woman's voice announced they would begin boarding. "It was nice talking to you," said Miles. "Hurry home to your cat. I'll hurry home to my horse." Rachel reached down to the floor in front of her and grabbed the handle of her carry-on bag and said, "Oh, do you live on a farm?" "I'm sorry?" asked Miles. "You said you have a horse. Do you live on a farm?" Rachel repeated. No, ma'am. I don't have a horse. I'm I meant to say cat." Miles was confused, and so he asked, "Did I say horse?" "I thought so," began Rachel. Then Rachel was interrupted by her husband as he said, "Boy said bunny, clear as day." Then with a growl, he added, "We're boarding. Let's head on over." Miles watched them move away, then looked down at his phone and checked for missed calls. Bunny lied on the back of a chair in the spare room at the back of the house. The chair, at one time, was Miles's primary chair in the living room, but now it belonged to Bunny and a newer chair took its place. Bunny slept curled up next to a partially open window, listening to a light rainfall. He felt a cool breeze come in through the window and instinctively wrapped his tail tighter around his body. It was late evening, and when Jessica came through the front door, Bunny didn't move or make a peep. When Jessica stood in the doorway to the spare room, Bunny remained asleep. When Jessica went halfway into the room, intent on closing the window there, Bunny had to resist the urge to whip his tail. When Jessica left without closing the window, the cat decided it was safe to go back to sleep. After a bit, Bunny heard the clanking sound of his dish being filled with food, but he did not move. In fact, it was an hour after Jessica had left the house that Bunny finally awoke, went out into the other room, and had his dinner. After he'd eaten, Bunny sat and stared at the front door until it was dark outside. Finally, he went and slept in the hallway. A clump of his black hair remained in the spot on the floor where Bunny had awaited nightfall. It was quiet in the stables at the late hour, save the occasional soft snort or neigh. Moonbeam stood at the gate to her stall, where she could lean over far enough to see outside the stable's entrance. There, the horse could see the mountain range was on her right side. She was proud of what she had accomplished in one whole day, and so she made up her mind to tell her brother Blitz the good news first thing in the morning, unless, of course, he got out of his stall somehow tonight. If he did, she would possibly see him before morning, but Moonbeam knew her brother would not, and probably could not breach his stall on his own, so she'd wait until morning. Then she slept, albeit unwell. Miles had been in the air for exactly 30 minutes. He was not tired, but he was a little thirsty. One day later, Brooklyn, New York. Raja stood in the center of the grocery store's produce section. It was 11 p.m. at night and he was still not fully awake. As his routine over the last 2 decades normally dictated, he was usually just getting out of the shower and easing into the night. But on that day, Raja was more tired than usual, and so he stood in the center of the produce section, resting his hands on the handle of the shopping cart, as his wife, Adala, chose from a nearby shelf full of herbs. Raja would begin his shift in 1 hour exactly, but for now, nothing but rest. Raja did not move. In fact, he even slowed his breathing to a minimum as he stood perfectly still. He let his eyes rest as he lazily focused on the front entrance of the grocery store. Periodically, the doors would slide to either side and new patrons would enter. The people moved at various speeds. He noticed that. Sometimes one or two people would walk past him and nearly come into contact with him physically. But no matter how close they came, Raja was never touched, nor was his cart. It was as if he somehow could repel the people with some anti magnetism. Then Raja went inward. Somewhere within himself, Raja stood as still and as quietly as ever, while observing a small team of workers at what appeared to be a modest construction site, somewhere within his own self. The workers wore denim overalls and small white painter's hats. They had shovels and wheelbarrows, and stationed all around were orange cones wrapped with yellow caution tape. But they did not work. In fact, they sat or lied around as if on break. Their tools were either lying beside them or stuck in a mound of dirt, which Raja noticed seemed to be blocking something, a passageway perhaps. He thought maybe the mound was a result of a cave in, or maybe there was some all new route behind it, or perhaps this place was a means of helping him continue to receive and accept the inner peace he had sought all of his life. Raja reminded himself he had gone inward, stopped thinking so much, and began to look around for the foreman of this crew. When he located him, they made eye contact. Raja stared at him for a few moments, and then the foreman smirked and shrugged his shoulders. Raja went outward again. Back in the grocery store, Raja began to move ever so slightly. He began with his eyes as he blinked twice and moved them side to side. Raja noticed how clean and white the interior of the store was. He noticed it was cool and smelled fresh. Yes, he was pleased with his surroundings and it made him calm. Not only did he like it, Raja needed it. He needed this environment, this sort of sterile, clean place with such magnificent climate control. But it was not meant to be. It was not who he was. It was not in his chemical makeup to be where he was comfortable because he was not needed in such a place. No, Raja knew in his heart he could only be where he could do the most good. Raja could only thrive in an environment where he could use his keen mind and his sharp skills to minimize, monitor, and control the probability and or impact of unfortunate events, or to maximize the realization of opportunities while traversing the streets of New York City. Raja was a cab driver, and he knew, due to forces well beyond his power to control, he could only ever be just that, a New York City taxi cab driver. Raja's wife moved down the aisle, and he followed her toward the organic broccoli. As he pushed the cart, Raja thought that even though he felt closer to himself than ever, he knew he had never been away from himself at all. After all, in lieu of the day's bizarre events, Raja knew he was going to places where he was always meant to be, physically and metaphysically alike. One day earlier, LaGuardia Airport, New York City. For New York, late afternoon in July was a time of heat and humidity, shirts sticking to your back, weird smells emitting from random alleyways, and stifling crowded street corners. But no real rudeness, no impatience, with exception to cars and the cabbies. But that's a different context entirely as compared to pedestrians. In large, the city of New York is a graciously hospitable town to know, as if the inhabitants and visitors are immensely humbled by the place itself, as if it were a godly entity merely allowing them to be there, their privilege, not their right. So they keep moving for fear of seeming idle and thus unappreciative of the endless gifts the city has to offer. And in this hurriedness, that gives outsiders a misperception that New Yorkers, for the most part, are ruthlessly impatient and obsessively self important when in fact they merely, knowingly or not, wish only to satisfy a higher power. On this day, as Miles quickly noticed, the gods seemed to be very unhappy as the sun shined down with maximum intensity and strength. The air was thick with moisture, but no chance of a cooling rain, for not a single cloud remained. Someone smoked a cigarette nearby, and the smoke lingered practically stationary in the air, making it harder to breathe with each passing moment. Miles stood there outside the airport. He waited in the cab line just shy of the point of the sidewalk he would have considered curbside. He guesstimated he would be waiting at least 20 minutes for a cab when he noticed some cabs moving past his area and around the corner, just that much closer to the airport's exit. Miles looked around. He looked behind himself and recognized just about everyone from his plane had joined him in the same line. Miles searched, but he did not see another cab line in sight. He picked up his bags, one in each hand, and took a deep breath. Then he stepped out of line. A move he knew might mean he would now have to wait another 20 or even 30 minutes in addition to his current 20-minute wait. But he did it anyway, and with that first step in place, he took another and another until Miles was successfully walking away from the only cab line he knew of with certainty. But he couldn't help it. He had a hunch a much shorter cab line awaited him. Despite his confidence, Miles took one last uneasy look back over his shoulder at the cab line and his fellow travelers, wondering if they had the right idea or if they were just sheep willing to do what everyone else was doing. Miles was glad to be apart from them either way, because it was all about survival now, survival and newness. He was in a new environment, not his home, but a new place. And this place was a major city of the world, so he decided not to take chances on regularity and looked instead for discovery. In his mind, Miles reckoned discovery leads to gaining the advantage, and he needed that to survive. Still looking back there over his shoulder, he saw the old lady Rachel, whom he'd chatted with at the airport back in Colorado. Rachel, yes, he assured himself, that was her name. Same as his mother, he reminded himself. And there she stood at the very end of that line with her impatient husband dressed in matching jackets. She seemed so simple and pure, and it was no great surprise to him she was not only looking right at him, but also sending a small wave in his direction. It was somehow also no great surprise that Rachel's little wave was accompanied by the most genuine and pleasant smile Miles had seen in a very long time. Glad now that he had left the line, if only for the chance to turn back and see Rachel there waving at him, he paused, slung one bag over his shoulder, and turned to wave back. She was in many ways the closest thing Miles had to a friend on the entire East Coast, so a wave in return was more than appropriate. Although Miles did not stop walking, which he then did backwards until he was at the other end of the sidewalk. There, fully around the corner, Miles turned finally and, to his delight, discovered another cab line with a total of 3 people waiting in it. Miles got in line and put his luggage down. He considered going back and signaling to Rachel and her husband Roy, but instead considered an insurmountable number of other possibilities such an act could generate. Something as simple as letting Rachel know there was a better option could cause dozens of people to come running around the corner with hopes of a better spot in line for one. Besides, Miles figured she was already no doubt locked in conversation with somebody about her experiences driving cross country or even her cat, who she missed so much that cat, bunny. Miles quickly went for his phone and turned it back on, which he had forgotten to do as soon as he'd gotten off the plane. Once the power was back, he waited several seconds until he was sure if a message had or hadn't come through from Jessica. Miles watched 2 of the 3 people in front of him get into cabs and drive away. The only other person left in front of him was having her luggage placed in the back of a cab, so Miles knew he'd be next. Then his phone vibrated and buzzed in his hand, and he saw a missed text message notification. Miles navigated his phone to the new message and read, Miles, Jessica here. Your cat Bunny is fine. He does not like me, but he is in good health, and I think he may be going bald, but he is okay otherwise. Have fun in New York and see you soon. Call when you land if you want. Once in the cab on the way to his hotel, Miles called Jessica. It was earlier by 2 hours in Colorado, but he knew it was late enough for her to be through with work and maybe even at his house with Bunny already. Miles let the phone ring twice when Jessica answered by saying, Miles, your cat hates me. I doubt it, Miles said in reply. He's just mad at me for leaving, if anything. Oh, said Jessica. Well, I'll try and cheer him up. Good luck, said Miles. Easier said than done. He's going bald too, I think, Jessica said. You said so, replied Miles while settling into the taxicab's backseat in your text. Oh, yeah, sorry, I kept hitting the caps key, she said, laughing at herself. Then she said, seriously, Miles, your cat is going bald. It's a little weird. I'm worried it's stress, but I don't know. Maybe it's just. Miles was hesitant to say the word. Alopecia? Asked Jessica. Baldness, said Miles. Likely, she agreed. I mean, the cat's got it pretty good here. Nice clean house, lots of room. You buy him good food. Maybe you should try introducing him to something, not sure, more fun? Something exciting? Keep him happy. See if it continues. If it does, I bet it isn't stress and it's just simple hair loss. Maybe, said Miles. Then he took note of his surroundings and realizing he was fully inside of the city, he said, well, I better go. I'm getting close to the hotel. And sure thing, she answered. I'll keep you updated, but this is pretty simple, so take care and have a good time. Thanks, Jessica. I owe you one, he admitted. You're damn right you do, she said in jest and quickly followed with, just kidding, Miles. We'll settle up when you get back. Then they both said goodbye, and Miles put his phone safely back in one of his bags. Jessica had left Bunny alone in the house again for well over 3 hours when the cat decided to get up and have dinner. A heavy sleepiness hung over him as he ate his food. Even after he ate, Bunny was drowsy and sluggish. In fact, the cat left half its food untouched. Then, for no reason, Bunny went into the living room and sat in the middle of the floor. He stared at the carpet and then at a plant in the windowsill above the couch. Bunny yawned while involuntarily meowing at the same time. He looked around, lashed his tail gently, and proceeded to give himself a bath, which lasted several minutes. Afterwards, Bunny found he had renewed energy. He went back and finished his meal from earlier and then used his litter box. Bunny walked up the hallway and lied down. Jessica had left the light on in the hall, and even without knowing she did it for him, Bunny enjoyed it and felt appreciative for it. Not because it was nighttime, but because the light had attracted a sizable moth. Bunny watched the moth dance around the ceiling lamp for a few seconds with some apparent interest. Bunny then quietly got up and moved into a nearby doorway, a darkened doorway, where the slithering cat disappeared into shadow. A small bit of fur remained where the cat had been in the hallway, but he was otherwise gone from sight. Things were quiet in Miles's house for the time being. Almost an hour had passed when the moth in the hallway, which had randomly begun to dip lower and lower, finally went low enough for Bunny's purposes. Having saved all of his energy and every ounce of his strength for the final strike, Bunny suddenly reappeared in the hallway, albeit midair. Claws out and jaws wide, Bunny delivered a death blow to the moth and managed to clobber it twice more before either of them touched the floor. And when Bunny did finally land, he quickly turned in place, holding his chin up and calling loudly. Then he circled the moth twice, whipped his tail repeatedly, and retreated back into the shadowed doorway. He meowed once more in victory after fading back into the shadows. Then everything was quiet as the dead moth lay next to a clump of cat hair at one end of the hallway. Miles had been asleep in his hotel for a few hours when the phone rang. Once checked in at the front desk, he decided a nap was in order. When he awoke, he looked at his watch before answering the phone. It was 7 p.m. "Hello?" asked Miles. "Hello, Mr. Miller," the man at the front desk said. "You have a guest in the hotel lobby. Mr. Price is here to see you, sir." "A guest? I'm not expecting anyone," said Miles, as the name the man had mentioned sunk in. Miles knew the name but could not immediately place it. The man on the other end of the phone responded promptly as he said, "Would you like me to tell Mr. Price you're unavailable, sir?" Um, Miles paused and rubbed his eyes. "Would you please hand the phone to him?" asked Miles. After a moment, the voice of an old man came across the phone and said, "Hello, Mr. Miles Miller. This is Mr. Jack Price. Your company is buying mine tomorrow, and I thought perhaps I could steal a moment of your time this evening." Miles sat up and began to tuck in his shirt. Then he put his watch back on, and while he held the phone between his ear and shoulder, he said, "Please wait right there, Mr. Price. I'll come downstairs." Then Miles hung up the phone and went to the mirror where he put on his coat and straightened his tie. He patted his hair and checked his teeth. He suddenly realized he was still very tired, and had the phone not rung, he likely would have allowed his nap to become a full night's sleep. 2 minutes after hanging up the phone, Miles stood in the room's doorway, assessing what he was about to put in his coat pocket: room key, five $20 bills, Colorado State driver's license, an ATM card, and 2 sticks of chewing gum. He placed everything in his inner coat pocket except the gum, which he left on the table just inside the room. but not before stripping a piece of gum from one stick, which he chewed in the elevator until about halfway down when he swallowed it. Then the elevator reached the lobby and the doors opened. Miles stepped into the lobby and straightened his cuffs as he approached the older gentleman who stood waiting for him. Jack Price was 3 years to 80 and no more than 5 foot tall. He had short white hair and seemed to move with a youthful energy, which Miles interpreted in his mind as awake. Unlike most senior citizens Miles knew, this man seemed to avoid the slow and tired effects of growing old. "Mr. Price?" asked Miles. "Mr. Miller, nice to meet you." Mr. Price offered his hand, and he and Miles shook. Mr. Price looked Miles up and down and shook his head side to side. Then he looked Miles in the eye and asked, "Kid, can I call you Miles?" Sure," said Miles politely. "Well, Miles, I want to thank you for wearing a suit to the city, to my city. Whether it be out of respect for the town or the occasion, thanks. But Jesus on the cross, you're not going to wear that suit to take my company, are you?" "Excuse me? Something wrong with my suit?" asked Miles, confused and trying desperately to shed his sleepiness. He wondered to himself why the owner of the company he was sent to acquire was here in the hotel at this hour, and to see him, the guy who was merely going to witness the acquisition. "Look," said Mr. Price as he opened his jacket and spun in place. "Look at this suit. It was made for me. I have a guy who makes my suits." Miles stood, ego bruised and insulted. He had been so caught off his guard with the experience, and especially just after waking up, that Miles found himself momentarily speechless. Finally, he said, I'm sorry. I wasn't expecting you tonight, and I was napping, so forgive me. I'm a little off my." Miles was suddenly interrupted. "Miles!" exclaimed Mr. Price. "Listen to what I'm saying, kid." Mr. Price walked over closer to Miles and said in a fatherly tone, "Look, son, I can afford to have my own suits made. You got it? My cufflinks could buy you a car, a nice one too, a very nice car. See what I mean here? Do you get me? I'm not trying to embarrass you, okay? But let's say we went to have a couple of beers right now, you and I. Guarantee the bartender knows my name or acts like he does until he can figure it out. I bet the first round's on the house too. And do you know why? Huh? Do you? Because my cufflinks could put the kid through college for a year. That's why. So, Miles, I'll be damned if the guy they send to represent the company that's going to take my own company away from me will be dressed in something the equivalent of my shoelaces." Miles was sure now that he wasn't being teased or made fun of. He could hear in Mr. Price's voice that he was sincere and spoke on matters of respect and honor. He did not sound like a broken man or a failed business owner, although Miles knew he was, in fact, just that. Still, Miles wasn't angry and decided it would be best to keep things as professional as possible, at least for his own part. Mr. Price awaited a reply, and so Miles said, "Sir, I assure you I have another suit I intend to use for tomorrow's meeting. Please." Miles sought to regain ground with the man, if only for his company and his own boss's sake, and so he said, "It is a great pleasure to make your acquaintance, and I assure you I mean no disrespect." "Okay, okay, Miles, I'm assured, I'm assured." The old man smiled and smacked Miles' shoulder with the back of his hand. Then he said, "All right, look." Mr. Price grabbed Miles' wrist and looked at his wristwatch while he held it up next to his own wristwatch. German," he muttered as he compared the time to his own watch. "Quality craftsmanship, this watch. Keeps perfect time." Then he let Miles' wrist go and said, "Yours ain't bad either." Miles grinned and shook his head. "Thank you, it was my father's." "Is that a fact?" mumbled Mr. Price while putting a cigarette in his mouth. "Well, go on then," he said. "I'll wait out front." "Sorry?" said Miles. "What's happening? Are we going somewhere?" "You are going back up to your room to put on the suit you're wearing tomorrow so we can go have it altered before the meeting. Something tells me it's not half as impressive as you think it is, and a little tailoring may help." We're going now to your tailor?" asked Miles as he recalled the mention of a personal suit maker Hell no, Miles, not to my guy. Unless you have that kind of money. You don't, do you? I didn't think so. No, we're going to see a couple of guys in town from Hong Kong. They come in once a year and outfit local guys with some fittings and whatnot. They'll do your suit on the spot, kid. Amazingly proficient and fast, these guys. You'll see. Come on. Miles was stuck. He couldn't move physically, but on the inside, he was all turned around and definitely did not have the money set aside for this sort of venture, no matter how affordable Jack Price thought it was. What's the matter? Asked Mr. Price, growing impatient. Move it, Miles. We still got time to get a couple of drinks afterwards. Yeah, stuttered Miles, but I don't. What? Asked Mr. Price, raising his arms. Is it a cash thing? Christ on the sticks. And with that, Jack Price broke out in a boisterous laughter as he put his unlit cigarette behind his ear and clasped a hand on each of Miles's shoulders. Then he said to Miles, Good God, if they didn't send a cheap bastard to my town to take my company away from me. Come on, Miles, get going. Tonight's on me, kid. Come on, let's go. Get back upstairs and put on that suit. Miles smiled awkwardly and turned toward the elevator where he pressed the button for his floor. Then, just before the doors opened for Miles, he heard Mr. Price call after him. And put on the shoes you intend to wear, Miles. Ah, hell, those aren't the shoes you plan on wearing. Miles, you can't wear brown Oxfords to a meeting in the city, kid. All right, hell, just go on upstairs. I'm going out front to smoke a cigarette. Miles stepped inside the elevator. Then, just before the doors closed, Miles watched Mr. Price throw a couple of fake boxing jabs at the doorman, who pretended to flinch, then laughed politely. Next, Miles saw the flicker of a Zippo lighter's flame, and lastly, he saw Jack Price step out front and finally light his cigarette. Miles went back up to his floor. As he re entered his room, Miles considered calling the office and explaining that Mr. Price had made contact, but it then occurred to him that he'd have a difficult time explaining the situation because the more Miles thought about it, the more he realized that the process had become highly irregular. He went to the closet where he hung his suit, unzipped the garment bag, and looked at it carefully before taking it down from the rack. Miles was suddenly less impressed with the suit than he had been when he originally bought it. One day later, Raja sat in his cab in front of his home and looked at the dashboard digital clock. It was 2 p.m., which meant he had 8 hours before he had to get up for the night and go to the grocery store with his wife. He was coming home late and figured he should just go straight to bed. Perhaps he would be asleep by the time his wife even got home. The day had been long, long and strange, stressful even, very stressful, but mostly it had been strange. Raja unfastened his seatbelt and took the keys out of the ignition. He reached for the handle to let himself out of the car when he suddenly and unexpectedly took pause. Raja went inward. Seemingly, Raja's eyes beheld the ocean and the endless horizon. Raja went outward again. Raja sat up in his seat, gripping the wheel with all of his might, and he realized he was nearly out of breath. Raja looked at the clock on the dashboard and saw that no time had passed, then released his grip on the steering wheel and flexed his fingers to relax them, while he tried to regulate his breathing pattern back to normal. Soon, Raja was calm once more. Unsure of what he just experienced, he positioned his hand over the door handle again. He hesitated for a moment, then opened the taxicab door. Feeling confident, he put one foot on the street outside of the cab. Raja went inward again. The world around Raja had vanished, and he was somehow, as far as he could tell, among the stars. Raja gazed up, up, up upon the heavens for what seemed like hours. Then Raja went outward. A sudden falling sensation washed over Raja as he braced himself against the half open door of his cab. Once the sensation had passed, Raja took a deep breath and tried to focus his eyes. He stared down at the street focused on a small pebble until he was calm. Then he looked back at the dashboard clock and saw that only a minute had passed since his second attempt to leave his cab. Then Raja slowly stood up, stepped away from his car, and closed the door. Raja locked the cab behind him. He guided himself by dragging one hand along the hood of his cab as the man moved slowly and steadily toward his front walkway leading up to his home. Raja made it successfully to the front door of his house without incident. But when he touched the door handle, Raja went inward. A bright light engulfed Raja's entire reality until there was nothing left but a strong wind and the blinding brightness of what he miraculously comprehended to be nothing less than all that is known and unknown in the universe. Raja went outward once again. This time it took Raja less time to calm down. So he knew he wasn't having a stroke or anything like that, if only because he seemed to grow used to whatever was happening. As best as he could tell, there was nothing physically or mentally wrong with him. Although he could not explain these dream-like episodes, Raja realized he had not fully ruled out the ability to control them. Raja thought for a moment there in his doorway, trying to remain perfectly still while collecting his thoughts. He counted to 10 forwards and backwards, and then he wiggled his fingers in front of his face, touching each fingertip against his thumb. Then Raja remembered the names of his parents, Salim and Adelia. Then Raja recalled the names of his grandparents, Rahim and Yalda, and on his mother's side, Abdan and Kari. Then Raja thought of everything he'd done in the last few days right up until the strange events of the current day, which he'd hoped would have passed after his shift ended, but clearly remained. But Raja stopped thinking so much because in that moment, he knew he was fine. His train of thought felt normal enough for him to know he could safely return. Yes, Raja convinced himself. He was as sane as ever. Then he tried to convince himself that what he'd felt earlier, which felt to him like going away, must have been more like going inside. Raja knew what happened in his head originated in his head. And if he was suddenly having what felt like an out of body experience, then he was not actually out of body, but rather in body. And with that notion, Raja opened the front door and went inside his home, then metaphysically and literally went inward. Everything was dark as Raja went somewhere within himself. The atmosphere was cold, stark, and void of anything tangible. Raja felt weightless and began to wonder what had become of his body. Then Raja reminded himself he'd gone inward. Raja was patient. Then the air grew slightly warmer, and somewhere nearby, Raja could see a small light. The light grew, and Raja saw what looked like yellow caution tape strung in front of him and barring his way. Then Raja went outward. Later, when Raja's wife had returned home from work, she found her husband sitting at the kitchen table. Raja had sat there at the table for the last couple of hours until he managed to master his new ability to go what he began comfortably to think of as inward. Raja took some time and briefly spoke with his wife about her day, but said nothing of his own. After that, he went off to bed with the promise of waking up to accompany her to the grocery store later that night. In his bed, Raja lied there awake for a few minutes, lost in thought. For the first time in a long time, the man realized there were things about himself he'd forgotten, things he had ignored, and things he'd never even known. His last thoughts before he fell asleep were of the ocean, the horizon, and the endless realm of possibilities within his own consciousness.